Okay, welcome to this very important meeting about Kashmir under occupation in the time of COVID-19, silencing the truth tellers. We have today a wonderful panel of speakers whom I will introduce in a moment. But first, just a brief bit of background. Kashmir, as many of us know, is one of the most militarized regions in the world. It's also a nation which has long been denied its historic right to self-determination. In August last year, the Modi regime effectively annexed Kashmir by abrogating Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. This also opened the doors to settler colonialism. Since then, Kashmiris have faced cutting off of internet services, imprisonment of prominent Kashmiris, stringent curfew regimes, and heightened repression targeting even young children. Against that background, we can see the playing out of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the internet blockade has made it virtually impossible for people to access medical care or even to speak to their families on many occasions when people are ill. And as we're being prepared for this pandemic, while there's one soldier for every 9 Kashmiris, there's only one ventilator for 71,000 people in Kashmir, a situation which is even worse than Gaza. Under cover of what is now a double lockdown, the Modi government is ramping up warmongering against Pakistan and at the same time intensifying repression and surveillance. And emblematic of this repression are the charges brought under the draconian Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is an anti-terrorism act, against a whole number of Kashmiri journalists. Those charged include the well-known Kashmiri photojournalist Mirza Zara, in connection with a 19-month-old photograph, which is actually owned by Getty Images. Also charged are Pirzada Ashik, the Hindu newspaper's reporter in Kashmir, and Gohar Jalani, who wrote about both Pirzada and Masrat and was accused of glorifying terrorism and indulging in activities prejudicial to the sovereignty and integrity of India. So these are just some of the journalists who we know have been targeted. Most recently, following the killing of a militant leader of the Hizbul Mujahideen, the most horrific repression, with civilian houses being blown up, the army and police using pellet guns to attack unarmed civilians, as they have done before, of course, in Kashmir in 2016. And at the same time, completely cutting off all communications from the Kashmir Valley, including mobile phones. In these circumstances, one of our speakers, Arshie Qureshi of the Kashmir Women's Collective, cannot join us on Zoom. However, she has very courageously recorded a video and managed to send it to us. And we'll be playing it for you. So without further delay, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mirza Saaib. He is a former president of the University Students' Union and gold medalist graduate from Nalsar University of Law, Hyderabad, India. He's currently based in the UK, where he's a candidate for the Masters in Public Policy at the Blavatnik School for Government, University of Oxford. He regularly contributes on issues concerning Kashmir through seminars, writing, and organization around legal and political issues of Kashmir. So welcome, Saaib. Please join us.
Thank you. Can I start now? Or?
Please do.
Okay. Thank you, Amrit. Thank you for having me. And over the course of the next few minutes, I'll just be going over the recent legislative changes that are taking place in Kashmir while we are under a COVID lockdown. So while we are not in a position to respond to what the Modi government is doing, they have with extended zeal gone ahead to make changes in Kashmir. So I'll be touching upon that. See, there's no doubt that the Modi government is exploiting the pandemic to ramp up its repression against Kashmiris. And there's always been a separate level of mistreatment reserved for Kashmiris altogether. While in India, soon after the Delhi program against Muslims, Indian Muslims were targeted with a war cry of Corona Jihad, just like the Nazis had used the epidemic typhus against the Jews. But in Kashmir, every symbol of cruelty has been used against us, from hate, fear, fanaticism, and it's been going on for a very long time. There's always been this slow burning hatred towards Kashmiris, which has now been funneled into a virulent anger, driving home the message to the people of Kashmir that nothing can prevent the Indian state from doing what it wants to do, not even a medical emergency. And the political success of Modi's nationalism, his populism, his xenophobia, is that he manages to reconcile India's political instincts with the intention of creating a single homogeneous group. And this group will have a singular grievance, a singular aspiration. Anyone who is not a part of this aspiration, by definition, is the other. By definition, they are the people who don't belong. And for us as Kashmiris, we have been reminded over and over again in the last 72 years that we do not belong. Now, the first thing that I want to touch upon is how the Public Safety Act is being used against lawyers. Even right now, we have most of the Bar Council of the High Court of Jammu and Kashmir, which is still under detention. Of the 400 habeas corpus petitions that were pending before the High Court, about 150 have been disposed. What is interesting to note in this is that the Public Safety Act is already a draconian law, and even the due process, the procedure which is established under that draconian law, is not followed in these orders. 80% of the cases that are dismissed, 80% of the orders that are dismissed on procedural grounds, which means that even the procedure which had to be followed for filing of a Public Safety Act order against any person, even that was not followed. But the sad part is that even under normal circumstances, when there is no COVID lockdown, even under those circumstances, it takes 2 to 3 months to get a judgment from the court which dismisses the Public Safety Act order, even though it was made without proper procedure. So if your Public Safety Act was made with due process, with proper procedure, it would take even longer to get it dismissed. And even right now, most of the senior lawyers of Kashmir, the members of the Bar Council, are under detention. Now, there are a few things. So I've divided this session because there is no PowerPoint presentation that I could use to capture attention. So I divided it into 2 parts so that I don't stray off topic too much. The first I've kept is where I want to discuss the not so sinister, not so visibly sinister moves of the Modi government, which is first is that Jammu has the secretariat functioning right now. The second being how names have been changed of some government bodies in Kashmir. And the third is how this lockdown is enhanced in Kashmir. The COVID lockdown is present throughout India, but in Kashmir, how it is enhanced. And the second part is the far-reaching and more sinister consequences of the Modi government, which are mostly the legislative changes that are taking place. First of all, it is the domicile law, which was passed just last month. While the world is dealing with this global pandemic, the question that comes to mind is that there's no one who has this urgency to move to Kashmir right now, while the entire country, while all of India is in a lockdown. So what was the urgency of passing the domicile law at this juncture, except to obfuscate the situation and not allow any kind of protest to take place? Because under normal circumstances, this legislative change would have been met with severe protest. The second is that of mining rights being given to Indians to mine and engage in resource exploitation in Kashmir without any facade of local government, without any interference of local government. The third is the cross-border LOC, the cross-LOC shelling that is taking place. And where I'd like to point out that around the world, the UN has mandated this, has called for a ceasefire. So global conflicts, nations that have been waging wars against each other, active wars, have called for ceasefires. But that does not apply to India and Pakistan, nor does it apply for India's approach towards the rebel militants in Kashmir. And finally, the last point being the killing of militants in Kashmir and their burial in secret right now, which denies Kashmiris even the right to grieve for their loved ones. So first of all, the point that I've made about the Jammu Secretariat, you see, Darbar move is something that happens every year in Kashmir. It is when files and offices shift from the winter capital of Jammu to the summer capital in Srinagar. It's an exercise in public waste. It's a waste of public money. It usually costs us about 100 crore, but it happens every year. And it is quite symbolic that while suspending our state flag, our constitution, the BJP has decided to retain this 148-year-old Dogra practice, which was started in 1872 by Maharaja Ranbir Singh. So right now they passed an order saying that the Jammu Secretariat will function simultaneously and the Srinagar Secretariat will also function simultaneously. So this was done because of the COVID lockdown. But the fear in Kashmir is that there is going to be more preference given and a move towards creating the political center of Kashmir in Jammu. There already is a talk of creating a separate administrative unit within the new union territory, because now we are two union territories. We are Ladakh and Jammu Kashmir. These are two separate union territories. So there is talk of creating a separate administrative unit within the Jammu Union Territory, which will then be given financial incentives for business, special economic zones to set up more employment and create more revenue within that zone. And subsequently, a delimitation process by which the number of electoral seats in Kashmir region will be reduced and the number of electoral seats in the Jammu region will be increased. So therefore, it completely depoliticizes the Kashmiri Muslim identity, the Muslim entity, which is predominantly present in the valley. The second thing that I mentioned was the name changing that is taking place, which is a signature Modi Vikas kind of move, where they renamed the public health works, irrigation, flood control department as the Jal Shakti department. And I don't doubt that next year we will hear about how Kashmir did not even have a Jal Shakti department until Modi ji came along and he amended Article 370 to give us a Jal Shakti department. And of course, there's the enhanced lockdown in Kashmir, where we have seen how metal barricades have been drilled into the concrete roads, into main roads in Srinagar localities. They have identified 90 red zones in the name of Corona, saying that this is where coronavirus is spreading the most. And in these 90 red zones, in most of them, they have drilled metal barricades around the localities. Now, as soon as this was done, there was a fear amongst Kashmiris that what if there's a medical emergency inside the locality? How will people get out? How will ambulances get in? And just a few days ago, there was a fire that broke out which damaged 3 houses. One of the fire brigades came from one end of the city, so it could not get in. So the other fire brigade, which was from connecting to that locality from the other end of the city, had to get in because that area had an opening. So they have moved to enact these barricades without any care or concern for the Kashmiri people. And the reason for this is not the COVID lockdown. The reason for this is because Kashmir is the site of the world's most densely militarized zone, where the Indian Army is present in all its might. So they fear that if there's a corona outbreak in Kashmir, it is going to infect the Indian Army also. And most of the soldiers live in closed barracks where the coronavirus can spread very easily. And also, we're talking about a lockdown where we have no real internet. So unlike the lockdown in India, where people can work from home, you can have online classes, nothing like that can happen. In fact, just today, one of our friends has written an article in The Wire, which I would recommend for the viewers to read, where she has highlighted how there is no possibility of online classes. Most school children in Kashmir who come from rural areas, they don't even know what a Google Hangout is. Even their faculty members don't know how to utilize it. But most of all, where the enhanced lockdown in Kashmir is hurting us right now is the medical emergency that it is causing. While we are in the midst of a global emergency, even after 8 months of internet restriction and communication restriction, the Indian state is not allowing people to access reliable high-speed data. And because of this, doctors and medical experts in Kashmir are unable to obtain updated and latest information about the COVID crisis. In fact, just last month, we came to know about how doctors were trying to download a 24 MB file, which had been uploaded by the NHS in UK, about their experience in dealing with the COVID crisis. It took them 8 hours to download that. And you cannot expect anyone to have any online classes or any work from home in that kind of a situation. But the Indian government doesn't care about that at all. I'll now quickly move to the more sinister. This was the slightly less sinister aspect of what we have experienced right now. But I'll move to the more sinister aspect now. And the first of the more sinister changes that are taking place. The first being that of the domicile order. So the Jammu and Kashmir reorganization order was passed last month, which paves the way for thousands of central government employees, especially those who are in the Indian Armed Forces, who have 15 years of residency in Kashmir, they are now eligible to get a domicile status in Kashmir. In addition to that, anyone who has served in Kashmir for 10 years, their children get an option of a domicile status. Or any person who has studied in Kashmir for 7 years, including 10th and 12th, they get a domicile status option as well. Now, the interesting point I would want to make over here is that Section 6 of the Jammu and Kashmir Constitution is the section that used to define permanent residence. And the Constitution of Jammu and Kashmir, it was made by the Constituent Assembly of Kashmir, which was never set up under the Indian Constitution, nor was it set up by any order of the Indian government. The Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir has been set up by the state itself, acting independently on the orders of the Maharaja and on the advice of Sheikh Abdullah. So the Indian government, under India's constitution, it is legally questionable on what basis can they remove the right that has been granted to the people of Kashmir under Section 6. It also complicates the 1954 presidential order which had been passed, because in 1954, the President of India passed an order which recognized the provisions of Article 6 of our constitution, where we were given the right to define our permanent residents, our domicile members. And this was also brought about by an amendment into India's own constitution through Article 35A. So we got various classes of citizens that we had created in this. And all of that has been removed right now. This is a major departure from Article 35A. And all employees, all children of central government officers, officials of PSUs, any autonomous body of the central government, public sector banks, officials of statutory bodies, all of these employees, their children are, and the employees included, are eligible to get a domicile status in Kashmir. And the reason this causes great concern for us is because now these people will be eligible for jobs, employment, as well as purchase of land in Kashmir. It is interesting to note over here that recently in Kashmir, there was a new party that had been floated known as the Apni Party. And those new leaders that are trying to come up to, in an opportunistic way, to make use of this new situation, had gone to meet Modi specifically on this issue of domicile status. And Narendra Modi himself gave them an assurance saying that no change will take place to the domicile status. Within a week of that, they passed this order. So it shows how much the Modi government, how much space it even gives for respect for these people who are willing to side by them. So finally, the reason that this is creating a big concern for us is because the number of jobs in Kashmir is already quite low. We only have 4.8 lakh grade A to grade D government jobs available for grabs. And even within these 4.8 lakh, even when we have this 4.8 lakh number of vacancies, the 2016 economic survey report has mentioned that a quarter of our population, 25% of our population between the age of 18 to 29 is already unemployed. So when we are supposed to compete against non-Kashmiris who have years of unhindered access to education, unhindered access to the internet, whereas we have months on an end where schools don't function, where the internet is not working, where because of movement restrictions, students can't go to school or study properly, and also the overall trauma that you are dealing with while living in a conflict zone. So when these people are expected to compete against people from outside Kashmir, it is definitely an unequal platform. And also the land which is now being allowed to, which is up for purchase for any person from India. In addition to the land, what has also changed is that mining rights are now being given to Indian citizens. This is the first time something like this has ever happened. After abrogation of our autonomy, for the first time ever, companies from Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, they all participated in public auctions for mining rights in Kashmir. And it was no surprise that these companies won 100% of all leases to mine Jammu and Kashmir's reserves of coal, marble, limestone. So you see, we have a lot of reserves in Kashmir of various mines, gypsum, bauxite, borax, besides coal and granite and marble. And until now, the local administration, the way this law was designed, it was meant to protect the ecology of Kashmir from excessive mining by reducing competition to only those people who are domiciled of Kashmir. And also from a legal perspective, that it is only the domiciles of Kashmir who have the right to land and its resources. So this was the intention of the law, but that has changed now, and 100% of the leases went to non-Kashmiris. It's also really remarkable the way they effected it, because this was the first time that these auctions were held online. this is it's very ironical that at a time when Kashmir has internet restrictions, you would hold auctions to all mines in Kashmir online, which completely frustrates any possibility of Kashmiris participating in those auctions. Many Kashmiri businessmen went outside Kashmir to participate in the auction, but they just could not compete against the bids that were being made by Indian businessmen, which were at the very least 2 times more than what Kashmiris were bidding. So at any front, they do not want these leases to go to Kashmiris. So on the ecological front also, it must be said that it does not matter if unplanned mining is undertaken by a Kashmiri or an Indian. Unplanned mining is going to cause irreversible damage to our ecology. And my last point is about the LOC shelling that is taking place and the burials that are going on in Kashmir right now in secret. On April 12, while the world was preoccupied with a humanitarian crisis, Indian soldiers moved into a village in Kashmir. They took all their artillery into the village. This is a civilian area, and they tried to use that civilian area to launch heavy artillery into Pakistani-controlled areas across the LOC. And it's fascinating how, you know, these two countries, they don't have enough money to buy masks for their citizens right now, but they still have enough resources to engage in a heavy exchange of artillery. And this resulted in the deaths of many civilians, many Kashmiris on both sides of the LOC. Kashmiri bodies have always been a site of violence, and we are not only oppressed in life, but we are now being stolen in death. Where earlier, when Kashmiri militants would be killed, their bodies would be taken for DNA testing and then brought to given to their families. But right now, what is happening is that the armed forces, the Indian armed forces, are burying these bodies in secret, and they're claiming that this is being done for social distancing because the funerals might attract crowds to spread the virus. Yet they are not even giving the bodies to the family members. So we can, at some level, it could be fathomable that in order to avoid large crowds, you have to bury them, you have to avoid the crowds from gathering. But these bodies can be given to their loved ones to at least mourn the dead. And the security personnel, the Indian security personnel are often saying that when we prevent funerals, we prevent youth from joining militants. So therefore, by burying them in secret, we are preventing more people from getting killed, and therefore we are saving lives. It's I'm at a loss to comprehend how insensitive the Indian government has become on Kashmir, and how insensitive, how with extra zeal they have tried to impose themselves on Kashmir. It also is important to mention that the JKLF leader, Yasin Malik, he has now been implicated in a string of 30-year-old cases, which are being pursued at blinding speed. And we do fear a judicial murder is going to take place because of how they are pursuing the situation, this case. The healthcare crisis is visible to everyone, as it was just pointed out by Amrit, that we have only 97 ventilators for 7 million people, which is a ratio which is even less than that of Gaza. But there is no hesitation for the Indian government to pump more soldiers into Kashmir. And right now we have one armed soldier for every 10 Kashmiris. And in conclusion, all that I can say is that India's response to the coronavirus in Kashmir, it violates international law, it violates the Geneva Convention, and all these constitutional changes that are taking place right now. I would advise that even other states in India which have special status, because Kashmir was not the only region in India which had a special status. Under Article 371, A to J, there are various other regions that have special provisions for them. This treatment that has been meted out, there is no guarantee that other states will also not be meted out the same treatment. But for us as Kashmiris, we are going to witness demographic, economic, political, social, all these landscapes are set to be altered. And we require the support of conscientious Indians to stand up and say that they will not engage in this activity. Conscientious Indians need to send out a message to the Modi government saying that even if you have legalized us buying property in Kashmir, we will not do it. Because the people of Kashmir do not want this to happen. And unless the people of Kashmir do not want us to engage in such activity, it cannot take place. So with that, I am happy to answer any questions on law, on these developments that I discussed, or anything else that you feel I need to clarify that I may have skimmed over right now. Thank you.
That's okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Saaib. If you have questions, please could you put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the of your screen. So thank you for outlining that picture of the really horrific cruelty that Kashmiris are facing. And for many of us, of course, it reminds us of some of the strategies being used by Israel in Palestine. So now I'd like to go on to a video which has been sent to us by Arshie Qureshi. Arshie is a researcher and women's human rights defender from Kashmir. She works closely with women victim survivors of domestic violence. Her work explores the question of women's access to justice systems in Kashmir. She's a member of Kashmir Women's Collective, which is a women's rights and advocacy group actively working against gender violence in the valley. So we'll now show you the video which Arshie sent.
Hi everyone, hi South Asia Solidarity Network. Thank you so much for having me in this webinar. I am in Kashmir right now and I won't be able to join you live for the session. So I'm sending this pre-recorded video, and the mobile internet services have just been banned across the valley, Kashmir Valley. The 2G services had been resumed just 2 months back, and now we're back to complete communication blockade. I have to admit that I was very reluctant in speaking up for this webinar, but because of increased surveillance and action against the civilians for whatever opinions they express online. But then I also realized that this surveillance project is not something new and unknown of. It's been going on for decades. It's just changed. And after 2019, the state is no longer in denial about it, about the surveillance. August last year changed a lot of things. The unilateral revocation of the Article 370 was done on a lot of pretexts like development and other things. And one of the arguments was that it was revoked to bring women's rights from the valley at par with the women's rights elsewhere in the country. But to dissect this justification and how it just falls flat, it requires a lot of time, which I obviously don't have at the moment, but I'll just run through a few aspects of it. Starting with the basic underlying assumption that is there that women's rights exist detached from human rights, which is a complete fallacy. Human rights in the valley get trampled time to time, and how do you expect women to not be into that category? I mean, you're doing it, you're inflicting it on the entire population, and women don't exist in separate time and space from that population. The recent case of UAP against a female photojournalist in the valley, who has been booked under the most stringent anti-terror laws, actually demonstrates how ready the state is to take the women's narratives out there. There are already very few female photojournalists working in the valley, and this UAPA has against a female photojournalist for her work, for posting archival photos on her social media, has an impact on how women journalists work and how the stories about women get told. We need to accept and acknowledge the fact that women and men have different experiences of conflict, and so far whatever we have seen is a male perspective of how conflict affects the life, how conflict has an impact on everything, say large things like economy, on lives of people, on businesses, on human rights. But having a female perspective was something that we only began to realize the importance of that when these female photojournalists and other journalists started working. They began telling the women's stories, women's experiences, and what it meant to be a woman working in that conflict, a woman just being in that conflict, living in that conflict, experiencing the violence around you. I mean, they were just. I read this interview of Masrat Zehra, in which she said that now there were people who were reluctant to talk to her after this FIR against her. So it means that these stories, how these stories are told, is definitely going to have an impact after this FIR against Masrat Zehra. And for women, female for women journalists in the valley. I mean, there are just a handful of them. It might act as a deterrent in join for those who want to join the field, and also for those who are already working out there. How do they tell these stories? Now they'll be more cautious of how these stories are told. So, which alters the nature of that story fundamentally. And Masrat was booked under a very extreme law, but there are a multitude of pressures that women journalists in the valley have to navigate every day. I am reminded of a story of a journalist after like August last year who was abused by the state forces, and she described it as going through hell. And she was not she had later written about it that she was not able to disclose it to her parents. Like, she was reluctant because that would have meant her parents not being comfortable with her working as a reporter, and that is how a lot of journalists in the valley get left out of the field. They're not able to continue their work. So women have to negotiate and navigate this pressure every day while working. I mean, there are people who would say that if you're a female journalist, if you're a journalist working, you need to put your gender perspective somewhere at home, and when you're working, you're just working. You're not a female or a male journalist. But we can't. We need to remember that there's a baggage to the state that they're working in, and we're working in an atmosphere that is highly like where the gender is highly politicized, where womanhood is highly politicized. So we can't really detach these two realities. So I mean, going after journalists or anyone in the middle of the pandemic is just not a good idea at all. But ever since the COVID lockdown started, the state has at least filed 6 UAPA cases. I mean, there could be more, at least 6 that I know of. And 3 of them are from the state, Jammu and Kashmir. 2 of them are females, and one of them is also a Kashmiri journalist, well-known journalist. The problem is that the state is normalizing the use of UAPA. It's similar to BJP legislator a few months back in Delhi calling for shooting of whoever they saw as traitors, which is basically everyone who dissents from the majoritarian view of the state. And that happened during, and the consequence of it was clearly seen during the Delhi anti-CA violence against minorities. People justified the act of shooting, and people justified the slogan. Both were justified. That is how this was normalized. And a few days back, I came across a page on Instagram which had shared a photo of a Kashmiri student who had posted something that was against Indian Army, and there was this page calling her out, calling for all forms of abuse against her. She was trending on Twitter and invoking of UAPA against her. It was scary to observe how she was being hounded online, again with a BJP spokesperson leading the bandwagon, and comparing her with the other 6 people who had been booked under UAPA. This suggests that he was clearly trying to say that she needs to be booked under UAPA, and so were others following him. And because they were taking a cue from that person, if a spokesperson can say that, then people definitely have to follow him. And that's how it just gets normalized. It just says that a person from the state was acting as an enabler of hate, because there was all sorts of hate online against her, all forms of abuse against her. So you're not only being scrutinized by the state, you're being equally scrutinized in public. And when it comes to public, they will definitely not respect the boundaries of it, which is happening on the Twitter. Speaking of the pandemic, it must be noted that like the way the state is handling it in Kashmir right now, it's not very different from how it has been how it has been dealing with the past lockdowns. I mean, there are barricades everywhere, there are restrictions, and there's no end to the state violence against the civilians. The counter-insurgency approach has made us more informed about the how our privacy can be easily compromised in this situation. And to adopt such a militaristic approach to a public health problem is basically giving a go-ahead to anything, if it means coming out of this pandemic. Like human rights don't matter here if it means like we are surviving. I mean, the human rights are thrown to the shelf somewhere. To adopt, I mean, there's this example of a young boy who was killed in North Kashmir, and then the state forces denied giving his body, handing over his body to his family, which we have seen being done during the militant encounters. When a militant is killed, they would try not to give the body to hand over the body to the family, fearing huge protests over it. But this time it was a civilian who was being killed, and his body was not given to the family on the pretext that they would be gathering and it could violate the social distancing norm, and it was just denying that body the dignity and the family the right to mourn the way they wanted to mourn. As a consequence, another civilian killed in the South Kashmir, the family just conducted the funeral rites very discreetly so that no one comes to know about it. Of course, we all want to contain this virus, we all want to get rid of it, nobody wants to die of it, but to do the same under militaristic approach implies abandoning human rights, concerns of the people in exchange for swift resolution. It's just a promise that the state is making to us, and they don't care. It's not a promise, I mean, it's just something being imposed on the people. And I mean, right now the justification is that we are in the middle of the pandemic. I don't think that justifies it, the cause. Moreover, we all know that, I mean, the way the state is acting, on one hand, it is depriving a family of the basic rights, and on the other hand, it's also depriving people of their rights, the people of the ways of fighting the COVID infection. We all know most of the health services and most of the other services shifted to online sphere once the lockdown started. And everything, almost the healthcare is fundamentally, significantly dependent on internet today. The state put out lists of doctors who people were advised to consult before visiting hospital for other illnesses. And this list had their mobile numbers. So if I, as a patient, am falling sick in a communication blockade, I can't go to hospital, and I won't even be able to contact the health service provider because it's a mobile number. Even if I have a fixed line connection, I won't be able to still reach out to the person that I want to reach out to. And it was blocking the mobile internet calling and calling services. It's like a collective punishment to the people of the valley. As soon as the lockdown started, I mean, there were a lot of discussions going on around how domestic violence was increasing in across the globe. Like, it's just an example that domestic violence was increasing, and the governments all across the world were trying to put in place emergency provisions for these women. In Kashmir also, the administration tried to put together some emergency resources like the helpline, and it was not only the state that was trying to put all these efforts there. There were non-state groups, voluntary groups helping, establishing helplines, and then sometimes, even if not a helpline, sometimes one-on-one communication with a friend or someone nearby helps to get at least some relief, some psychological relief, or maybe some people might seek help from friends or somebody who's living nearby. But snapping all these communication lines meant that all these ways of reaching out, all these ways of seeking redressal were snapped all at once by the state. And we only have we perhaps 1% or less than 1% population that has fixed line connections, and depriving rest of the population of it, including women that state claims to be fighting for their rights and standing up for their rights. It's just inhumane. It's a traumatic experience to be through. And I mean, how were they expected to reach? It was state clearly telling them that, yeah, you can only exercise your rights to the extent that we want you to. Until we sort our thing together, you have to wait. Your rights have to wait. You have to wait in whatever situation you are. And this is, and imagine the impact Kashmiris requiring emergency help. How were they supposed to call for help? There's no, I mean, there's I mean, COVID has certainly not taken away all the illnesses or health emergencies from the world. People still have to deal with it, but with no communication lines, it's just clearly a violation of rights of people. I think that's all that the time permits me to say. And if you have any questions or suggestions, or if you want to discuss further on all of these points, I'd be happy to do that. You can reach me out on my Twitter handle, which I request my host to share. Thank you so much.
That was really great to hear that video, which was sent out under such very difficult circumstances. So if you've got questions for Arshie, then her Twitter handle is capital ARSHIE, capital QURESHI, that is Arshie Qureshi. Okay. And also just a reminder that you can send your questions to the other two speakers through the Q&A box. I'd like to now go on to our third speaker, Dr. Mehroosh, who is a co-founder of the Kashmir Solidarity Movement, a global group of Kashmiris dedicated to raising awareness of the Jammu and Kashmir conflict. Its objective is to facilitate discussions on self-determination of the people of Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh. So thank you very much for joining us, Mehroosh. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Amrit. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. First of all, thank you very much to South Asia Solidarity Group for organizing this. I know everyone is going through the lockdown right now, but yet I mean, obviously in Kashmir, the situation is quite difficult, and it's good to remind everyone of the status given. The communication ban continues intermittently in the region. I think the previous speakers have covered quite a bit already, but I'll try to just maybe perhaps like focus on the things that may not have been mentioned before, and just highlight a couple of other things that they've mentioned, but kind of stretch that point a bit further. Amit, do let me know if I go beyond the 10-12 minutes that have been given to me. I'll start with just kind of putting forward a few numbers. First being that there is one ventilator per 71,000 people in Jammu and Kashmir at the moment, and one doctor per 3,900 people. But yet there is one armed personnel per 10 people in the region. So those numbers and those ratios tell us quite a bit. I mean, I think just if the key takeaway message from those numbers is that the access to healthcare is obviously very limited, but access to our army personnel is very high, or for army personnel, access to Kashmiri bodies is very easy in comparison for Kashmiri people to access healthcare during a global pandemic. And whilst all of this happens, of course, the communications ban continues, and 4G is quite a futuristic technology that many Kashmiris would not have experienced for a while, and mobile networks also not working. So that I won't labor that point because my the previous speakers have already mentioned that. But what does how does the pandemic work, how does the militarization of the region affect the access to healthcare during the pandemic? As Saaib had said, there are about 90 red zones in Kashmir at the moment, and I think more than 15 of them are in the city of Srinagar only. And for these red zones, the surveillance beyond already what the army has access to, like everything really, as Arshie has also mentioned, but in these particular red zones, the Ayodhya Setu app, it's mandatory for everyone and each person in the red zone to fill up and log their health status through that app. So that's another way of like surveillance in those red zones. Now, from what I understand, is also that the classification of these red zones is quite arbitrary at the moment. So the army will declare a region red zone irrespective of like how many cases of COVID-19 maybe have been discovered there. And these are particularly done to be able to cordon off regions where the army thinks have people might retaliate against the occupation more so than other spaces. So, particularly the last week in Kashmir has been quite difficult because as with the killing of Hizbul Mujahideen's head, Naiku, but also just a few days before that, when there was a battle between the local militants and the army, severely neurologically ailed teenager Hazim Butt was killed in a so-called collateral damage, and as Arshie said, his body was not even given back to the family. Now, we've known and we've experienced as Kashmiris collectively the necropolitics of the occupation, but for this time, for a civilian's body not to be returned back to their family members is a gross violation of human rights, of course, but also that incident in itself has triggered normalization of calling for carpet bombing of villages in Kashmir by army personnel, Indian army personnel on Twitter, and these people have a huge fan following on Twitter somehow, and the responses to these calling for villages to be decimated, and because a few army personnel were killed in the gun battle, the responses are very, interesting and sad at the same time, because how a huge number of people are just happy or are agreeing with this ex-army personnel, and as a Kashmiri, it's very difficult to see how these messages are being normalized. The other thing that has been happening during the pandemic, and whilst everyone is busy globally in dealing with pandemics, with the pandemic, there's obviously across LOC line of control shelling that is happening. And now India has actually taken a very offensive stance all of a sudden during a global crisis, which is with not just with shelling, which is obviously regular and keeps happening, but also recently, I think 2 days back, they've decided to show or cover the weather forecast for Gilgit-Baltistan, which is under the Pakistani administration. Now that hasn't happened before, and that softer way of just saying that actually no, Gilgit-Baltistan back to us from the Indian states, Indian army is a move that they're going on. It's not a defensive against Pakistan act, but more of an offensive act now. And the world somehow has not paid much attention to this at the moment. And I raise this right now because of what is happening in the UK itself, with the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, releasing a joint statement with Labour Friends of India, suggesting that the Kashmir conflict is a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan. Now, if the Labour leader had any kind of decolonization education in in his like preparation to before coming into the office of the opposition, he would have remembered, or he would have realized that what Britain's own role in the Kashmir conflict has been historically, but also more in contemporary times. Obviously, historically, we know the British sold Kashmir, and including the land and its population, to Gulab Singh, and then we know what has happened, and rest so-called is history, as we said, which is contested, but that's one of the key roles of like British colonial history in where we stand today, 70 years later. But also in contemporary times, the close relationship that Britain and India share due to the economic ties are something that which has deterred the British government from taking a stronger stance when it comes to the human rights violations or even self-determination of Kashmiri people in Indian occupied Kashmir. In addition to all of that, because I don't think Britain's role in relation to Kashmiri self-determination struggle just stops in terms of its ties with contemporary ties with the Indian economy, but goes beyond that. And the reason for that is that the right-wing Hindu lobby in Britain itself is rising and cannot be ignored anymore, not just in relation to Kashmir, but also in relation to the anti-caste bill that was supposed to be passed. And there's a huge lobby within that, from that group in Britain. And Amrit, maybe you will be able to tell us a bit more about that, and if it comes up in the Q&A, and if it is of interest to the participants today. But this is an interesting group of people who we're not, who I think sorry, I'm just trying to construct the sentence, but not enough focus has been put on this group and their role in lobbying for the Tory party, but not just limited to the Tory party as we are seeing it. This is within the Labour Party right now, and how they managed to lobby Keir Starmer, who's only been in office a few weeks now. And this rise of the diasporic Hindu right is not just relevant to the UK, but is also is quite global, and we've seen that in happening in America also. In particular, there is a Twitter group handle called Hindu Americans, and which has also a huge following. They recently, in the last week, have I mean, in general, they're quite anti-Kashmir and anti-Kashmiri human rights, but they've also, with the winning of the three photojournalists from Jammu and Kashmir, winning of the Pulitzer Prize for photo visual, I don't remember the exact category, but of the three photojournalists from Jammu and Kashmir, two of them are from Kashmir, and they've received huge amount of like criticism from this Twitter handle called Hindu Americans. So you just see that, like, to the extent that they've called the Pulitzer Prize organization anti-India itself, just because they've given a prize to Kashmiri photojournalists. Now, so I mean, obviously, this is a small anecdote that I'm really I'm mentioning right now, but it just says how strong the lobby groups are internationally, but not in the UK. In the UK, obviously, it's related to politics and stuff, but even beyond this goes beyond the UK. So just returning back to Kashmir and talking about like journalists and the clampdown of the journalists in Kashmir. Saaib will be able to tell us more about the UAPA, but just briefly about how Masood Zara and a couple of other Pirzada Ashik and other people have been, FIRs have been lodged against them. I suppose the silver lining has really been that like amount of solidarity people have shown with both Masrat and with Abizada Ashik, and that perhaps might have like stalled their arrests, which were imminent about 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago. Masrat's case is very interesting, and it's important to highlight how difficult it is for female journalists to work in the conditions they're working in, and particularly Masrat's really is a very talented photojournalist, and she's already had a lot of difficulty as a female, being a female member of the journalist fraternity in Kashmir. She's faced a lot of discrimination against, and it's also not difficult, as Arshie said, for women to like move around under state surveillance and under the gaze of the army in Kashmir. So it's kudos to her and her work and how she's highlighted what female perspective of the occupation in Kashmir, and that work is super important to bring and highlight the Kashmiri female stories out to and globally. Beyond the journalists and the clampdown on the journalists in the economy, and Saaib very brilliantly has explained a lot of different things and about how the economy in Kashmir has been affected by like almost the longest lockdown in Kashmir, all the way entering the 10th month of the lockdown, 11th month of the lockdown now since August 5 last year. But I'd like to mention two specific things over here. One is the banking system. So some of you may have heard about something called the Jammu Kashmir Bank. The JK Bank is quite famous, like one of the biggest financial exports of Jammu Kashmir region, which just meant that like it's quite integral to the economy of Jammu Kashmir. And recently, in the last year or two, there's been like a clampdown on the governance of the bank. And 2 weeks ago, a list of new trustees and governors of the bank has been released, and all of them are not Kashmiri. When usually on the board, even after the Indian government took over the bank a few years ago, there were always supposed to be Kashmiri people on the board, and now that is not the case. Now this is interesting because they're using legal ways of controlling the financial system in Kashmir. Why is that important to the human rights in Kashmir? Well, one of the fears of the business community in Kashmir at the moment is that after the abrogation, the economy has been locked down for so many months, and now it's time for people to pay back their loans that they've taken from the banks. Obviously, it's been difficult for the business community to be able to do that, given they haven't traded for such a long time. They're worried that they will have to sell their assets in distress to Indian businessmen because the bank is not going to be favorable and give concessions to Kashmiri businessmen. As we can see across the world right now, governments and banks and financial systems are giving leeway to small business owners, but even big business owners, right? Because no one is trading. In Kashmir, obviously, the lockdown period has been much longer. Trading has essentially been stalled since last year. Small agrarian communities who rely heavily on JK Bank's loans are particularly struggling. So that's one part of how the Indian government's occupation goes beyond like violence in terms of physical violence, but the violence in terms of financial institutions is something to be noted. The second part of the economy that I'd like to mention is that many of you would know this, is that international funds transfer are not allowed in Kashmir. So during the pandemic, whilst in the UK we've raised like what, £30 million for the NHS, right? Which is a different story completely. We are not even able to do that in Kashmir. We don't have a state that invests in the healthcare anyway. But even if like the global population wanted to support Kashmiris under occupation, we will not be able to send that money to Kashmiris. And the reason being obviously is that like the Indian government has traditionally, historically not allowed international organizations, humanitarian organizations to work in Kashmir. And classification of humanitarian crisis is, the politics of classification of human rights crisis is an interesting point to be raised over here, because when there is humanitarian crisis, for example, in Yemen, and the UN declares it a humanitarian crisis, the international development sector, their cogs start running, and people start raising money and then funneling money into those affected areas. I mean, obviously, that cannot happen in Kashmir because Kashmir, just even calling Kashmir a humanitarian crisis in itself will be, a huge political process in itself. And if international organizations or the Western countries, including the UK, are going to keep calling the conflict a bilateral issue, we will not even be able to name the crisis in Kashmir ever a humanitarian crisis. And so any kind of relief for the Kashmiri people will be very difficult to realize in that situation. Lastly, my last point is related to access to land, and kind of coming back to the abrogation and then linking it to the pandemic. The abrogation has been instrumental in and will be also in the future, instrumental in reducing access to land for Kashmiri people, not just in terms of the land grabs by the army and by militarization, or by businesses when they will come and buy off land, or the Indian government will give Kashmiri land away to these businessmen, but also but more so in terms of the public land that exist at the moment, like the forest land, the wildlife preserves, the meadows, the glaciers, all of that being moved away from the hands of Kashmiri people to industrialists is something that needs to be noted. Now, what I want to raise over here is the human development and the welfare implications of this land grab from the state. The indigenous population in Kashmir relies heavily on forest land and wildlife reserves and grazing land and pastures. The Bakarwals, the Gujars particularly, but also beyond these two particular communities, a lot of them rely on the forest land for food, nutrition, fuel, and multiple other things. To be able to live, to have access to some kind of livelihood. And as an economist who works on agriculture and food policy, I'm extremely worried about the implications of the abrogation on access to land for these communities, and then by that issues of production for the food system itself. So the Bakarwals and the Gurjars are extremely important to the livestock rearing and production of animal source foods in Kashmir, and them not having access to the grazing land in Kashmir will be in Jammu and Kashmir is going to be extremely problematic in the future, in the medium to long term future, to the nutrition status of the region. And we already know the primary healthcare services are dismantled, but access to food has always been the one factor that allows the Kashmiri community to stay away from the brink of destruction and poverty because of the rural-urban connections. And I can talk a little bit more about agrarian relationships and food system relationships in Kashmir. But linking this access to land back to the pandemic, 9, 10, 11-month long lockdown is obviously detrimental to the production of the food in Kashmir. And with the pandemic and the worsening conditions of the surveillance in the region, where the access to food will only deteriorate. And we've seen for the first time, I think the people have been documenting how food insecure Kashmiri people have become, which usually would not be the case even, and had not necessarily been the case during the Burhanwani siege of 2016. So I will leave it at that place at this point now, but I'm happy to take any questions to expand on the food systems later, because I know I've kind of rushed that through. So yeah, thank you very much to everyone for listening.
Thank you very much, Mehroosh. That was a really fascinating analysis of the finance as well as the economy in Kashmir. Well, a few questions are coming in. I also was interested in what you said about the BJP and its supporters globally and also in England. But at the moment, I think let's focus on what's happening in Kashmir. We maybe come back to that later in the meeting. So a few questions have come in. The first one is from Sneha Jha, who says, what is the status of folk in the NIA custody? That's the National Investigation Agency. Yasin Malik, Asiyat Andrabi, Rashid, and others. And of course, there are many others. How much visibility do we have in the NIA proceedings? Like it was mentioned, there's a heightened threat of custodial murders. Do we know reliably what's going on with the detainees as well as their cases being handled? Information in the mainstream press is clearly not enough. So would you like to, would either of you like to comment, or both perhaps? Saaib, do you want to say something to start with? Can't hear you. I think we can't hear you. I think, have you muted your...
Could you just check your volume and unmute yourself, Mirza Saaib? Can you hear me? If you could put your hand up to say...
It says it's unmuted. Maybe it's the volume. Did you mute? Is that better? No.
Saaib, it might be easy to leave the meeting and come back again, perhaps.
Yeah, well, would you like to, maybe Mehroosh, you would like to say a few things?
To be honest, I'm not the best person to respond to the NIA custody question, just because I'm not an expert on that topic and I don't know much, but I'm sure like Saaib wouldn't be able to comment on it. Or perhaps a Kashmiri person who's on the call might want to comment, but I'm just looking at the other questions. One is related to Kalpana's question related to growth of mining and what...
out and then people will know. She says, can you say a bit more about the growth of mining and what other kinds of corporate plunder are facilitated by the domicile law? Do you see this as a new phase of settler colonialism in Kashmir?
Am I audible now?
Now you're audible.
Okay, perfect.
Do you want to go first then and talk about the NIA?
I'm happy to. If Mehroosh has some...
Yeah, go ahead and then we'll go back to Mehroosh.
All right, sure. Was anything answered while I was gone? So I won't cover that then.
Sorry?
Was anything answered already while I was gone? So I won't cover. Okay, sure. So the first thing that the question that I got was, there are 4 parts in this question. One is the status. Second is the visibility of the proceedings. The third is custodial murder, which I'll just touch upon again. And fourth being the cases of other detainees. I think these are the 4 parts of your question. So the first thing to understand is that the proceedings under the NIA are a heightened form of oppression and legalized oppression against these people. There are other people who have been arrested under UAPA, PSA. So the detainees that we're talking about, they have been detained under the Public Safety Act. whereas Yasin Malik, Engineer Rashid, Asian Rabi, these are people who are being harassed as well as targeted by using the NIA. Now, specifically with respect to Yasin Malik, there was a series of events that took place. First, they banned the Jamaat, the JKLF, and then gradually they started increasing pressure against these leaders and detaining them. And right now, say Asian Rabi, her property has been attached by the NIA, and they've all been charged under a terror funding case, which was initiated in May 2017. So since then, they have been harassing these leaders and going after them. Right now, Yasin Malik is on hunger strike. So we don't get this information in Indian media that much. The way we get this information is through the lawyers of these people who are meeting them and then relaying information, or their families that meet them. For example, Yasin Malik's family has met him in jail. They came out and they did a press conference where they said what was happening. They also said how the judge was not taking into consideration. He was not even taking down the statements that were being made by Yasin Malik. So, this is a way where in courts often, where certain evidence is not taken on record. And then when the judgment is drafted, the judge can always, it can always be argued that this was never a part of the record. So we have never considered this while making the judgment or the decision. The point that you said about custodial murder, just to clarify, I wasn't talking about a custodial murder. I was talking about a judicial murder. The difference being that we don't think that anyone is going to murder Yasin Malik while he's in jail, but they can be, because that would be a custodial murder. That is, if the police beats him up, or if someone else commits a murder of this political detainee. I doubt that would happen, but it's not far-fetched. It's not too far-fetched to think that it cannot happen. But I doubt there will be a custodial murder. What I mean when I say a judicial murder is that just because a death sentence has been passed by a court of law, does not mean it is a legalized death. It is a legal process that has led to that death sentence. That is a judicial murder. So even though it has been passed by a judicial forum, it is still a murder. There's been no weighing of the evidence. And again, like I said in the discussion, that this is a 30-year-old case which has been now opened up against Yasin Malik. If I give you the example of all the Pandit killings in Kashmir that have taken place, 2 years ago, Pandit groups had approached the Supreme Court of India asking for reopening investigation, or at least conducting investigation in any of the massacres that have taken place. The Supreme Court said it's been too long, the evidence is not there anymore. So in that situation, they do not want to engage in any kind of investigation, but where it suits them, they will open up cases against people. They'll build charges against them. Right now, all their properties have been attached under the NIA. Now, as regards to your question on the visibility of these proceedings, there is very little visibility. We only come to know of what the lawyers of these people tell us about how the proceedings went, or what their families tell us. They do make some statements every now and then and tell us how things are going. This is how we know that Yasin Malik's condition right now is critical. He has been on hunger strike for many days now. So, and he's on hunger strike because he's not being given a fair trial. And there's no record of this in the media. There's no conversation about this on how the judicial process is completely being abused. And later, because in India, there is this argument as to you cannot question the army and you cannot question the judiciary because they are supposed to be apolitical. But the last 1 year, if you see how the Supreme Court has ordered, how has passed judgments, migrant crisis, the Supreme Court has no time to take cases on that. But Arnab Goswami's defamation or Arnab Goswami's harassment gets heard in 1 day's notice, just in 1 day's notice. So what I mean to say is that there's little to expect in terms of impartiality in this situation. And finally, your last point about the situation of the other detainees, it is quite bad with all of them. And the way the proceedings are functioning with other detainees is that judges in the court are choosing which habeas corpus matter to take on board and which not to take on board. For example, Mia Kuyum, who's the president of the Bar Association, he has been under detention for all this period, and there has been consistent effort as to getting his case even heard properly. So it's not been taken on board regularly. As opposed to that, they take on board the cases of those people who they feel are less of a threat. So the president of the Bar Association of Anantnag, the president of Bar Association of other courts, smaller courts in Kashmir also, many of them are in detention even now, but they have not been released, nor are their matters being taken up on a regular basis. So they are often being sidelined because there's so many cases. So the judges can always say it's not in our control. The roster comes as it does. So yeah, I think those are the 4 parts of your question. Just if I could add one thing over here, which in connection to what Arshie was talking about, May I go ahead, Amrit?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So Arshie had mentioned about women's rights in Kashmir. And I think it's very important to dispel this argument because it has come up in every single forum on Kashmir that Kashmiri women do not have a right to property if they marry non-Kashmiri men. And this is, it's a lie, because in 2002, the Jammu and Kashmir High Court had passed an order saying that if a Kashmiri woman marries a non-Kashmiri man, she does not lose her right to property. It is the non-Kashmiri man, that is an Indian or any other nationality, who does not get a right to property in Kashmir through his wife. So that is what the position of law is on this. But it has been used in every forum, just like the argument against LGBTQ rights that, oh, Article 370 is homophobic, it's against decriminalization of Section 377. So the same way they've used this women's rights argument also. It's important to dispel this, that in 2002, you can look this up also, in the case of Sushila Sahni versus the state of Jammu and Kashmir, where the judgment was passed that Kashmiri women do not lose their right to property just by marrying a non-Kashmiri man. And there is a jurisprudence to why that position existed before 2002 also. Our property laws are patriarchal in nature. They pass from the father, from the husband. So there is a reason for why it exists, but it has been rectified as well. And because we have legislative powers in our state, we can rectify any other law also, which may not be progressive enough for its time. So that is for us to decide how we go ahead and the political process we undertake to rectify our laws.
Thank you very much, Saaib. Actually, that last point was very interesting because it shows that, in fact, the law on marriage is quite pro-women, and it's being shown as something very patriarchal. So it's important to dispel these myths. Mehroosh, would you like to go on with this last question from the previous question from Kalpana, which you were about to answer?
Sure. So I'll tackle both of Kalpana's questions related to mining and then the forest land question. So, well, the thing is, there's something called the JK investor forums, and that have been going on for a while across mainland India. So in big metropolis cities in India, there have been economic forums that have been taking place. Primarily, you look at these, when you see photo ops from these forums, majority of them, there'll be like men sitting around like a table and like a podium, and essentially talking about the various different opportunities available of buying land and accessing land in Kashmir. And obviously, like no Kashmiris allowed on, in part of these things. This is an open, pro-development myth that Indian government has been, talking about for decades. It's not the development myth is not particularly new to BJP, but this is the general Indian states, like in Congress times, also the same narrative was, talked about. Now this, but obviously previously, when the Congress government was in power, they could not have done much because of this, because of the Article 317. Now we know the abrogation allows Indian companies to come in and take away land. Now, one thing I do want to make clear is that previously it wasn't that non-Kashmiri businesses could not trade in Kashmir. That wasn't the case. It was just that they could not own land. So, but leaseholds were previously given to non-Kashmiri businesses in conjugation with a Kashmiri partner. So similar to what happens in India, and like you can also, this is a economic policy, like I said, which has basically been the basis of South Korean development also, like the Asian Tigers development. That is, you invite FDI from abroad, but you have like a specific quota for like national companies to partner with international companies when they come in. That was the same case when in Kashmir, where like when Tata came in to build hotels in Kashmir, they had to partner with a Kashmiri company also. Saaib, you can correct me if I'm wrong later on, if but that was the case before abrogation. So it was not like the Indian businessmen could not have come in and worked in or partnered in and traded in Kashmir. Now, obviously, That's one of the things that the Indian state has been saying this time. Because of the abrogation, now now Indian businesses can come in. Now, obviously, businesses will not go to regions where which is marked by political fragility and violence regularly, where the businesses are shut for good 6-7 months every year, right? So that's just one thing. And I know I digress slightly, but that's also related to the mining sector. The environmental clearance to get for mining projects and mining mines in Kashmir was very high. The threshold was quite high, and the JK Forest Department usually is in control of these like clearances. Obviously, the army always got the clearance because it was the army, and multiple times the JK Forest Department, the State Department would have like would have fought with, or not fought like, but basic as in negotiated with the army to not give them specific wildlife reserves and stuff like that. But with the abrogation, that power of the JK administration has obviously been removed completely. That's what's happening with the mining. Now, Kalpana's question is whether this is a new phase of settler colonialism. In many ways it is, because of like how the abrogation is going to lead to demographic change in Kashmir, right? So, and what we are worried about is that the close relationship between the Israeli state and the Indian state at the moment, what that might bring in terms of the Indian policies in Kashmir to displace Kashmiri people from their own land. Beyond displacement is the lack of access to land, which is why I mentioned the forest land, and Kalpana also says this. Had asked that question about where does Kalpana's question go? See, I can't see Kalpana's other question, but it was related to like. Sorry.
Shall I read it again?
No, she had an extra question but I can't see it anymore. But I think I'll stop there. But Amrit, there was another question related to the first question by Shafaq Hussain, which you might want to also address.
Take that a little bit later, perhaps, if that's okay. I think, could you just maybe either of you, perhaps Mehroosh, you first, touch on this question of from Nadim Khan about how Kashmiri livelihoods will be impacted by the land ownership changes, including by the dams that India keeps promising to build.
Okay, so Amrit, I couldn't hear you properly, but I think what I heard was how Kashmiri livelihoods have been impacted by the dams.
That's right, which India has promised to build.
Yeah, of course I can. Usually I have slides on this, but I'll just quickly talk through this. I mean, the NHPC is like the state public corporation that that is responsible for hydropower electricity across India, and they were established in Kashmir a few decades ago, where they've, I think, built about 5 dams already, and there are 3 more projects in that have been approved in the last year or so. Now, majority of, like, I think a third of, I don't have my slides here in front of me, but a third of all hydroelectric power generated in India and for comes from Jammu and Kashmir region. Of that, a third, only 13% is given to Kashmiri population to consume for free, as they say, and the rest that we electricity that we consume in Jammu Kashmir, we have to buy at a specific rate from NHPC, and that's the kind of resource extraction from the Kashmiri people, where we don't have access to our own natural resources. And multiple times previously, you know, the NC government or the PDP government have tried to negotiate with the Manmohan Singh government to say that to ask for further control of NHPC and access to the dam, the resources from the dam, but the Manmohan Singh government also declined to give any kind of like autonomy to the Kashmiri state government over NHPC. Now, I mean, people over here who've studied displacement due to dams would already know, like whenever dams are created, multiple the villages around that region, around the dam, are obviously disrupted because of the construction of dam, and that's the impact on particular livelihoods where the dams have been created. And these dams have been created obviously in like extremely fragile eco zones. Like remember that Jammu and Kashmir is in the foothills of the Himalayas, so it's an extremely fragile ecosystem, and the violations of ecological violations by the Indian state and the Indian army are multiple. And I can give you a list of ecotourism, so not eco, but like ecological damage via tourism because of religious tourism that has been done in Kashmir. And there's a huge list, but I'll stop at that point.
Okay, thank you, Mehroosh. Did you want to say anything about that, Saaib, on these questions?
Could you repeat the question that I'm supposed to answer? I'm losing my audio in between.
Okay. Did you want to answer the question about mining? The role of mining?
Yes. Yes, I can just add one point. I've already spoken about it in the discussion, but what I could add about the mining part is that, you see, there are many minerals that the governments have identified deposits in Kashmir right now. Apart from what I mentioned of limestone, gypsum, bauxite, borax, there's also gemstones such as sapphire, garnet, and tourmaline. So all these are up for grabs in Kashmir, and if there is unrestrained mining that takes place, it will have ecological consequences. It's as simple as that. But what has to be remembered in this situation is that we only have 30% of our land area, which is fit for habitation and cultivation in Kashmir. So the remaining portion is all forest land, wetland, or glaciers. And that's where the government is trying to engage in what it calls development. They have right now allocated about 60,000 acres of land for such SEZ projects, special economic zones. And they're not just building companies and factories in these regions, which can have an impact on our ecology. It's also being created in a form of a religious tourism, where the one example I can give you is just near Vaishno Devi temple. They are building a replica of the Tirupati Mandir, over 100 acres of land. And this land has to be given by the state government free of cost. In fact, they're even going to push the state government to build the temple for them in the name of tourism. So it's going to become a religious pilgrim hopping culture that they'll try to create over there. And there are many businessmen from India who are trying to buy land in Kashmir. One example is of this MNC Global, which is one of Dubai's largest medical healthcare providers. So the CEO of the company is an Indian who offered to buy 3,000 acres of land in Gulmarg, where he was going to try and set up a kind of a film city. But later it turned out that he was caught up in financial irregularities and he has dropped the idea. But I'm sure someone else will come and take up this project. So that's what's happening with respect to mining and land, that companies are going to try and buy land in Kashmir. Gradually, the price of land will go even higher than what it is right now. And there will be lesser land available for cultivation in Kashmir, for indigenous cultivation, which makes us more and more dependent on importing our food, our grains from India. Gradually, over the last 72 years, it has already happened. So we have already become fairly dependent on India for our food supplies, our medicine. Everything comes from the national highway. If the national highway is shut, then we won't have meat to eat. There will be a shortage of milk. There will be a shortage of food grains. So that's what India has engineered to make Kashmir dependent on India right now. Can I go ahead with the other questions, or?
Yeah, no, the other, I just wanted to, did you want to say something about the dams, which was the related question, which Mehroosh answered? That is, do you want me to read it out? She says, can you please expand on how Kashmiri livelihoods will be impacted by land ownership changes, including by the dams that India keeps promising to build?
Well, of course, there's displacement that will take place, and we have already seen massive such displacement in what is the region that is controlled by Pakistan, the Mangla Dam, and even in Gilgit and Baltistan, even in the northern areas, there are dams that are being built over there right now, because of which there is going to be a lot of large-scale movement of people. In the side of Kashmir, which is controlled by India, the emphasis is more on controlling the economics of the zone, and they are right now focusing a lot on mining operations than on building new dams. The fear is that if they engage in building new dams in Kashmir, it might spark an escalation of conflict with Pakistan. Because if they restrict water supply going into Pakistan, it might become cause for some kind of a flare up.
Okay, thank you. There's now an update which I'd like to read you from Azmat Khan, who is the JKLF representative in UK. He says Yasin Malik is in Tihar jail because of the NIA case, but not allowed to represent himself in the Jammu court with regard to the Tada case. He has threatened to go on hunger strike if he is not allowed to represent himself in this case. But since the proceedings have been halted because of the change of judge, etc., he did not start his hunger strike. But his lawyer tells us that his health is not too good. Okay, and Azmat also has a question, not related to that, but separately. And the question is, can any panelist shed any light on what life is like in Jammu or in Ladakh? My understanding is that restriction in these regions are severe too because of the opposition to BJP plans. For example, Article 370 and domicile rules. So would you like to, do you want to answer that first, Mehroosh, or? Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I'm just reading the question again before I answer.
It's at the book office.
What life is like. I mean, to be honest, like, I would prefer maybe someone there. I know there are a few people who've joined us on this call from Kashmir. I would rather have them answer that question than myself. I mean, maybe Saaib, you want to respond to that question? Because,
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, with respect to Jammu and Ladakh, this is a very valid question because we do end up talking a lot about the valley itself, but that's also because that's where the brunt of oppression is most visible in the valley. However, all the legal changes that I discussed that are taking place, they equally affect any Kashmiri, whether from Jammu, whether from Ladakh, anywhere else. Now, what's interesting about Ladakh is that the Modi government has just announced a budget of 6,000 crore for Ladakh. The population of Ladakh is just between 2.5 lakh to 2.6 lakh people. That's about 260,000 people in total. So a total budget of 6,000 crore means nearly 10 lakh people 10 lakh rupees per family, or 3 lakh rupees per person, 300,000 rupees per person for the entire region of Ladakh. That is more money than most people earn in an entire year in that region. The reason the government is doing this is, number one, to create two classes of haves and have-nots in Ladakh. So the Muslims of Ladakh who do not support the BJP government will become the new have-nots. And the Buddhists or the Muslims who support the BJP government will become the haves who will get benefited by the schemes that the government is going to launch within this 6,000 crore budget. However, there has been unanimous and vociferous opposition to the BJP government's move on domicile law, on internet shutdowns, on Article 370, on everything across the state. From Jammu also, there are multiple groups that have come out to oppose it. In fact, one example I can cite just from 2 months ago was when the High Court was in Jammu, the Jammu High Court issued a notification calling for employment of labor in the court. And it was open to Indians to apply as well. But the court went on strike. Again, after that, one example I can give you is the registration of trusts, registration of various corporate entities was usually done by lawyers in the court. However, that was taken away from them and given to non-legal associations. And there was even talk of whether we would even have a high court in Kashmir, because now we're a union territory. There was discussion because the State Human Rights Commission, the State Disabilities Commission, all of these had been dismantled and taken out to Chandigarh. So there was initially discourse on whether we will even have a high court left over there. So this is the situation in Ladakh. In Jammu, people have more to lose because the money that will be pumped in the form of big businesses, it is more likely that that money will go to Jammu than to Kashmir, because Kashmir is a highly volatile zone where it's difficult to have any kind of business. So no person in their right mind is going to invest millions of rupees into Kashmir, where anytime the internet can be shut down, anytime there can be movement restrictions, so anything can happen over there and your money is at risk. But in Jammu, the situation is more controlled. The situation is the numbers of protests and the number of shutdowns, hartals, curfews in Jammu is far, far less. So the chances of this money working is possible in Jammu, but then it will disadvantage all the local businessmen of Jammu, the smaller shop owners, the kirana walas, the small businessmen in Jammu who have small startups, small businesses. They are the ones who will face the biggest disadvantage. And this is something that they also are recognizing, but they are unable to do much against it right now. Because whether we protest or whether we don't protest, the BJP government and India in general is going to do whatever they want in Kashmir. And one of the big failures of the movement thus far has been that they've gotten away with what they want to do.
Okay, thank you. There's another question now from Nadeem Khan, and he says, on the topic of women, is it true that the Indian Army is harassing Kashmiri women in their homes? And is this impacting on how much freedom traditional families allow women to have? So, Mehroosh, would you like to answer that?
The violence, gendered violence against women has been going on for multiple decades in Kashmir, right? And we know that from the stories of Kunan-Bhojpur, the two villages that where mass rapes have occurred, but also beyond there, beyond just that, there people who grew up in Kashmir during the 90s and the 2000s will tell you about like simple, subtle, not even subtle, but like the gaze of the to grow up under the gaze of the army is quite difficult in itself, right? In terms of like security and like in terms of families, concerns about women not being able to move around. Like I remember in the 90s, the moment it used to get dark, no one was allowed to go out. You know, there was no way. It doesn't matter if you're a woman or a man, you would not be outside because of the fact that like there are checkpoints, an army would pick you up and all of those other things that would happen. So in that sense, the occupation affects the body of a Kashmiri person in the same way, almost in the same way like it affects a woman and a man. But obviously the repercussions on and the violence against women and the sexualized violence against women is the taboo of that in the society is taken in a very different way than it is with men. I have to say that sexualized violence is not specific to women only in Kashmir, and the sexualized violence again also happens rapidly against men in Kashmir. The torture camps that existed in the 90s and the early 2000s and that are coming back up now, they've had so many testimonies from men who've talked about how they were harassed sexually in those camps. But in terms of security for women, I mean, you have societies across the world are patriarchal in multiple different ways, and obviously the concern of like you know, sexualized violence against women has a different kind of connotation than men. So I think I'll leave it there because it's a much more complex like question, so yeah, I will leave it there. I'm not sure if I answered the whole question. But
no, but I mean, it certainly gives some idea. I think, you know, hopefully Nadeem Khan is happy with that reply. I just have a couple of questions which really relate to Israel. The first one is from Tariq Mahmood, who says, to what extent is the Indian judicial system in its treatment of Kashmiris mirroring the Israeli system's treatment of Palestinians? And related questions from Marie Mushtaq, who says, has the increasing India-Israel political ties led to India adopting strict measures of control in Kashmir? What are some examples? So would you like to answer that? Maybe Saaib can go first. And then,
well, definitely there are parallels in the Israeli legal system and the Indian legal system. However, the situation in India is actually worse than what it is in Israel. At least in Israel, their prime minister has been charged with corruption, and he is going to face trial for that corruption. In fact, he's been elected now thrice. They had 3 different elections. They couldn't get any majority. And he also is trying to use the corona pandemic to effect, he has imposed his government right now. He doesn't have legitimacy because he doesn't have majority. But there is a corruption case against him. I doubt there can ever be a corruption case against Modi, and Modi will face a trial for that. So in many ways, I would say that the Indian legal system is far, far more oppressive because it crouches itself in such broad phraseology and beautiful language, which sounds so egalitarian and just and balanced, that it becomes very easy to forget that Kashmiris have no access to justice in India. One parallel, again, I can give you of the Israeli legal system and the Indian legal system. In fact, not just the Indian, the Kashmiri legal system, which is controlled by India. I can cite this case of Tajammul, which was just a few years ago. Tajammul was 11 years old, and he had been charged under the he had been detained under the Public Safety Act. Again, he's 11 years old. The magistrate did not even meet the boy, which is a violation of his Miranda rights. That the magistrate has to be produced before the magistrate. And he just recorded a generic order saying that Tajammul is a stigma on peace-loving citizens and he's a threat to the national security of India. Passed the order, and Tajammul was in detention for quite a while after that. So similarly, you see so many situations, so many cases of young children young Palestinian children who are being detained, arrested. You see videos of them crying when they're being taken away by the forces over there. So it is very similar in that sense, and there is no accountability in both situations. But the difference, I would say, is that in Kashmir, there is a legal structure which denies accountability. So legally, Kashmiris are denied accountability from the armed forces that are present over there. For example, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act grants immunity to the Indian forces that are present in Kashmir. So it's a legal act which through a legal mechanism is granting you permission to do an illegal activity. Whereas in Palestine, in the occupied areas, there is no legal act that allows them to do it. It's an occupation, it's a war, so there's an army present over there. The difference over here is that by utilizing a semi-legal structure, you create a facade that there is an access to justice, there's an access to rights. But on the international forum, it has to be established that there is no access to justice. If you look at Maqbool Butt's case, Maqbool Butt was hanged without even a confirmatory order from the lower court. If you look at any other legal case in Kashmir also, which has gone, and you compare it to how the same facts are utilized by the government of India in a different case which comes from a place in India, and the same facts are applied in a case from Kashmir. For example, in the Naga People's Movement case, which is a case against the AFSPA in the Northeast in India, the Supreme Court judgment says that exercise utmost caution. Even though in AFSPA you have been allowed to use force up to causing of death, you have to exercise utmost caution in exercising of that power. But when the same situation comes from Kashmir, the court's attitude is absolutely different. In fact, just 2 years ago, when after Burhan Wani's killing, there were so many protests in Kashmir, many people were being blinded by the pellets. The Jammu and Kashmir Bar Association went to the court saying that these pellets are not non-lethal. They are causing permanent blindness and many people are dying because of them. Instead of taking on the case, the Supreme Court told the Jammu Kashmir Bar Association, the lawyers, that you take a guarantee, you give me a guarantee that no one will come out and protest. Then I will pass an order that pellet guns should not be allowed. In what justice system will you expect? As a lawyer, it's not my job to give a guarantee that no one will come out and protest. I'm saying that you are using excessive force. I'm asking for that excessive force to be curtailed. In addition, one more example that just came to my mind right now. Just 2 months ago, there was a case in the Jammu and Kashmir High Court where the same issue was being discussed, whether pellet guns can be, we can pass an order to stop use of pellet guns. So there is an association in Kashmir. It's the Association of the Pellet Blind Victims. First of all, it is shocking how in Kashmir, there are so many people who have been blinded that we actually have an association of pellet victims. So that association of pellet victims asked to be impleaded in the case to assert its position that pellets have done X, Y, Z injury to us, this injury, that injury. There are pellets in people's lungs, pellets in people's brains, pellets in the skull which cannot be taken out, blindings. So they wanted to get impleaded as a party in that case because this is an issue that concerns them. But the Jammu and Kashmir High Court said that they do not need to get impleaded. So the main party that is representing itself as an association which is directly affected by the use of these weapons was not even allowed. So I would say that yes, there are many parallels in the Israeli legal system and the Indian legal system in the sense that there is no access to justice. But the Indian legal system is even a notch higher because it employs the use of broad phraseology and equitable sounding laws to deny us justice.
Okay, thanks. So really it is legally sanctioned injustice on a huge scale.
Judicial murder.
Mehroosh, did you want to add anything? No. The next question, I think now we have come to an end on the questions which are about Kashmir directly. But there's a couple of questions which we should take now, which are about Britain and the activities around Kashmir in Britain. Firstly, there is, this is from Shafaq Hussain, who says, how can I...
Always the most interesting to me because of, I hope like such platforms like these can bring people together to organize ourselves. So I have to say it's really been highly disheartening to see Keir Starmer's statement, and then with the joint statement with the Labour Friends of India, but also his, like, yesterday he released a counter statement and a response to all the backlash that he received because of calling the Kashmir conflict a bilateral issue, which does not go far enough to, you know, retract his his stance on the fact that to him Kashmir still remains a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan. So in terms of building solidarities, I think something that I mentioned already, like this rise of the Hindu right and globally, but particularly in the UK, is of extreme concern. Should not be of extreme concern just to the Kashmiris living in Britain and British Kashmiris, but also other British South Asians, be it from India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. But the reason being that because of how they've been lobbying as a group against the anti-caste bill in the UK, and that's alarming, and previously they have had some traction and, you know, had a positive response from the UK government in multiple ways. You also see the rise of Indian right-wing politicians within the Tory party at the moment, with Priti Patel being the key cabinet minister, Rishi Sunak, and so on and so forth. So there are definitely enough reasons for us to join efforts when it comes to lobbying in the UK, but also in the EU, around raising awareness about how the right wing in India is linked to the right wing and white supremacy in the UK and in the EU. And previously I made the point about highlighting that multiple white supremacists in the EU have taken their cue, or have been motivated by Hindu right-wing ideology previously. So this is not like an isolated event that is happening in Kashmir or just in India, but also there are huge links between what is happening in India and in Kashmir with what is happening here in Britain. So lobbying our MPs and EU MEPs will be something which is of extreme importance, when they're highlighting how detrimental it is to the progressive British, or global community, where minority rights are respected, is of obviously important. So that's response to the first question. And then the second question was around sorry, I'm just trying to find the second question. Would be interested.
It says would be interested in knowing more about activism around the UK and ways in which activists are challenging Labour's recent reposition on the siege.
Yeah, so one thing that I was quite positively surprised by was the fact that a lot of progressive left-leaning groups within Labour and broad left in the UK have come out and called out Keir Starmer on his position on Kashmir, which has been heartening to see as a Kashmiri who lives in the UK. So there's been socialists of color who have released a statement. There was a group within a lot of Labour MPs also themselves had voiced their opinion about Starmer's statement. So those have been great. But I think within that, and Momentum, I think, Momentum Internationalists, like a specific group within Momentum, had also said release a statement against Starmer's position. So I think there are pockets. I think people are recognizing that the Kashmir issue is not just a bilateral issue in left fractions, but we do need to consolidate that effort and bring the Kashmir issue to and change the narrative around Kashmir conflict from issue between India and Pakistan to just more of a narrative around Kashmiri voices.
Okay. Did you want to say anything about this, Saaib?
It's all covered. I can just add this much, that there are lots of Kashmiri groups in the UK who have been meeting online with various Labour Party members, because they've been working with them for many, many years. So they've built relationships with them. We're trying to reach out to them, but it's still a long way away. It's difficult to make the argument which influences them completely to change a stand that has publicly been taken. There won't be any U-turns happening anytime soon, because if he has said it's a bilateral issue, and that is anyways the UK government official stand. The UK government, irrespective of the Labour stand, the UK government's official stand is that Kashmir is a bilateral issue. It's going to take a while to change that. But in the recent, the response letter which Kia issued after the backlash, I see a little bit of progress in that letter. I mean, I'm trying to be optimistic over here amidst all the darkness that we are surrounded by. I sense the optimism in the line where he has said that their position is that Kashmir is an issue which has to be resolved by India and Pakistan with consultation of the people of Kashmir. Instead of making references to a UN resolution, because the UN resolutions do not support Kashmiris. The UN resolution supports Kashmir becoming either a part of Pakistan or India. It does not give the option of independence to Kashmiris. So a positioning which advocates that India and Pakistan must resolve Kashmir in consultation with the people of Kashmir, I would say definitely a better position than where he was earlier, and recognizing the fact that he's not in a space where he can completely make a U-turn. But again, as a victim and as a person who is living this oppression, I would want to see far better than what we see from our community as well as from the leadership in the UK. So definitely there's a lot to be done even now. But yeah, Mehroosh has covered this quite well.
I'd like to add a few things because, we in South Asia Solidarity Group have also taken a stand on this particular issue. We produced a statement along with Indians for Labour, which was printed on Labour Hub and also on Counterfire and shared quite widely. Now, our approach to this whole question is that in terms of Britain, if you're going to take up the Kashmir issue, you can never be successful unless you also confront the Hindutva forces in this country, because they are the ones who are creating the problems around the Kashmir resolution and so on and so on. So here we have to simply look at this as a struggle against the forces of fascism, who have their allies and their collaborators in Britain. And if you look at, it's interesting to look at some of the Hindutva columnists who write in Britain in things like Asian Voice, for example, who are saying that Modi and others should follow Israel and build a global community of Hindus, which reacts every time Modi is attacked or the Indian government is attacked, right? So that is very, very similar to the kind of Zionist approach to Israel outside of the country. So, we feel also, what we did was we looked at the Hindu Forum's response to Keir Starmer. When he had asked for a meeting, he went out of his way, he reached out to them to have a meeting. And they responded by making 3 points. One was that they were unhappy about the caste issue, which one could go on about, but I don't want to go on too long on that. The second point was about Kashmir, of course. And the third point was quite interesting. It was about the way in which anti-Hindu, there's a Hindu phobia, which is similar to anti-Semitism. And this is hugely problematic because there's no material or historical basis for Hindu phobia, unlike anti-Semitism. And it's also purely ridiculous, but it shows the links between the Zionists and the Hindutva forces outside of those countries in Britain. So our approach is very much that, and also about the response from Keir Starmer to Andrew Gwynn, I think MP, who had written to him. Yes, it's good that he has mentioned in passing the Kashmiri people, which at least is something we can feel a bit optimistic about, but the tone of the letter is deeply worrying because it's got a very colonial tone, like, you know, you two communities are fighting and we don't want that, you know, we want to bring you together, which shows that there's no principled approach to this. That this is about human rights or this is about international concern about human rights. So I think there's a long struggle ahead in Britain over all of these issues. It's been absolutely wonderful, this meeting. We've had so many comments saying how great this meeting is and how much people have learned. Obviously, we have to keep this up and have a lot more meetings like this. So thank you so much to both to Mehroosh as well as to Saaib for these very illuminating discussions. So we'll see you again, hopefully on Zoom and then outside of Zoom. Thank you.